Welcome to Speedrunner Reviews. In this series I'll be analysing and reviewing games using the mindset of speedrunning. This video will look at the game from three perspectives. First, the casual experience, which is how most people will first play the game. Next, we'll discuss the speedrun experience, including all the interesting tech and how well the game holds up as a speed game. Finally, we'll look at the tool-assisted speedrun, showing what the game looks like when pushed to the theoretical limit. If you already know the game and want to jump straight to the speedrun part, I've left timestamps in the description. Today we're looking at Enduro Racer, primarily for the Master System, but it was originally an arcade game by Sega. Before we get stuck into it, if you end up enjoying this video, please consider subscribing to keep up to date. I'll have more videos like this coming out regularly, and subscriptions help out the channel a lot. So now let's talk a bit about the history of this game. So Enduro Racer was originally released as an arcade game in the mid-80s. So they had the stand-up cabinet like this and then the sit-down cabinet where you actually ride the motorbike. It was really cool because you could do the controls as if you were actually riding it, and there's lots of cool little bits and pieces, like if you pull back before a jump you tend to go faster. And that pulling back mechanic actually did translate down to the Master System version where you have to press down to go faster over a jump. Only downside with these machines is apparently they get broken pretty quickly because people would pull back really hard to go over jumps and stuff. Eventually Enduro Racer was ported to other systems, mostly in that original 3D perspective, except on the Master System version they went for this top-down isometric kind of view. I actually don't mind that they went for this top-down view. It makes it pretty easy to see what's coming up rather than them trying to attempt a 3D perspective. I have played a few 3D racing games on the Master System, and more often than not you're just having a whole bunch of blind corners and it's not as fun to play as this one. While doing 3D is always an impressive technical feat, in practice it's often better to do something like this. And a little bit about my history with this game. So I sort of came across this game at a garage sale and I decided to pick it up. It was pretty rare to find Master System games at garage sales back in those days because it was sort of the mid-2000s and people weren't selling them as much anymore. But I was really into Gran Turismo 3 at the time, and a bit of Gran Turismo 2 as well. And that had endurance races, which would actually take you like 2 or 3 hours to finish those races sometimes. And so I thought, oh cool, that'd be awesome on a Master System. Not realizing, of course, that this is about a 10-minute game and it's not really like an endurance race. So since I was expecting something a little bit more like Gran Turismo, I was originally a bit disappointed with this game, but after playing it for a while, it turns out that it's more enjoyable in sort of a short sitting to just blast out 10 minutes of really fun gameplay than sit there for 2 hours grinding around the same track over and over. So I eventually got used to the controls on this game and it ended up being a whole lot of fun. So the basic mechanics are that you go along the track like this and your main priority is to pass a whole bunch of cars. So every car that you pass gives you a point, and then when you get enough points you can buy upgrades. So you can see at the end of the first race here we passed 7 cars for example. There's a whole bunch of upgrades worth 5 and then some worth 10. We'll see here that I don't get any upgrades in that footage because the engine upgrade is the one you're waiting for. Our normal speed is 200 kilometers per hour. But if you get that engine upgrade you can actually go all the way up to 263 kilometers an hour, which is fantastic. So the basic strategy is just to keep trying to pass roughly 10 cars in each race and try and get the engine upgrade for each race because it's going to make you go a lot faster. In fact, you'll see in this footage here, the first couple races I was taking about 44 seconds and then with the engine upgrade it takes only 29, so it makes a huge difference. Now the point of this game is not really to win or lose per se, it's more to grind down and get the best possible time. There is a time limit, so if you do run out of that, you will just restart the game and get like a game over. But once you're able to get through all 10 races, you're really just trying to grind down that time as good as possible. So at the end of the game you'll get a screen somewhat like this, and I imagine people would have been sort of competing for their best times with their friends, or if you're in the arcade of course, competing against the arcade high score. Also, Enduro Racer has one of the best end screens ever. I'll just let this one play out, it's epic. Who would have expected a game about racing to be so deep? So as you might have seen, the structure of the game is 10 tracks, and it sort of does these 5 tracks and then repeats that same 5 over again. But the next time you play through the tracks, there are more vehicles on the course, so it makes it a bit harder and you pass 20 cars usually instead of 10. Actually, the upgrades sort of scale up with this, so after this race, the engine ends up costing 20 rather than 10. Everything essentially just doubles. But if you're good enough at like utilizing the ramps and stuff, then you normally don't have too much trouble unless you literally just run into one of these other races. And speaking of ramps, when I played this for the first time, I did not realize that you have to press down on the D-pad to maintain your speed over a ramp. So every time I went over a ramp, I just lose a whole bunch of speed. As a solution to this, I would always just weave around the ramps and try not to go over them at all as a kid. I'm actually amazed at how I managed to get through the game that way. Of course, if you don't want to press down on the D-pad, you can buy that suspension upgrade, but realistically, it's not worth it over the engine upgrade. Now, everything I've described up to now is on the English version of the game, but actually the Japanese version of the game is very different. The Japanese version still has 10 tracks, but it doesn't just repeat the same 5 tracks over and over. What it does is it just has 10 unique tracks. And it doesn't do that weird point scaling thing, it just has, you know, the 5-point upgrades and the 10-point upgrades for the whole game. So if you have a way to play it, the Japanese version is definitely preferred for this game. I actually find it a little bit harder because some of the extra 5 tracks that they added in are pretty treacherous. Even this first one here, it's not easy to avoid everything. In fact, one of the scariest parts of the Japanese version is this very last track. There's just rocks like everywhere, and it's so hard to dodge them. If you do hit the rocks, you gain some damage, and if you gain enough damage, you will lose the game. So it doesn't just slow you down, it also impacts you on that scale. So this game is definitely worth playing and trying out. Just remember to press down before you go over a ramp if you're playing it. I'd encourage you to try and get through the game because the time limit is kind of tricky to beat, but then also sit there and grind down your time. See how good you can do. After all, the game may not be as realistic as Gran Turismo, but it's pretty good for 1987. Alrighty, now we're going to move on to the speedrun. We'll see there's a few different categories here. You got to beat the game with the English version and beat the game with the Japanese version. They're the two main ones. Unfortunately, the Japanese full version is empty, and then the arcade version only has one run. So we're going to look at the Japanese version first, because in my opinion it's sort of like the proper full version of the game, and then the English version is sort of the condensed version of the game, but we will look at both runs. Important to mention that these categories use in-game time to track their progress, and that's going to become very important as we look at the speedrun tech. So before we look at any speedruns, we really need to talk about how the timer works in this game. It is very strange. So we'll talk about ending the race first. You can see I got my timer values blown up on the bottom left there, and if I got the 15 seconds left, then that's going to translate into the total time taken for the race. It's 45.9 seconds. Now the weird thing about this is I can go slower. So let's just slow down before the end, and I've got 15 seconds a bit further in. 45.3 seconds, which is pretty strange. So essentially what it's doing is it's calculating this 45 correctly. That's the total time of the race. 60 seconds minus the 15 gives you the 45, that's fine. But what it's doing is it's just really calculating that second bit. It's not doing the subtraction again, it's just literally putting that second bit on the end. So 18 in this case translates up to 40, if that makes sense. So the optimal way to get the best time is to slow down heaps until you eventually got like a very low time in the 15s. So if that's 15 OE, that's going to be an even better time, 45.23. And eventually, if I can get it, it's a bit tricky to line it up. 15 OD is going to be even better. So the optimal way to reduce game time in this game is to sort of wait until the timer is just about to tick down to 14. So it hasn't finished ticking down from 15 yet, but it's about to hit 14. And that's going to get you the best possible time, because it's going to give you those low center second values. And in like a Taz or something, you'll see all 01 on the end, because they've waited till the end of the second to do it. So it's a bit counterintuitive, and you wouldn't do it in RTA, you'd sort of just play the race normally. But almost like getting a worse time actually leads you to getting a better time, provided you don't lose an entire extra second. Now the other thing to mention is ramps. So ramps don't speed you up. They do for about a frame when you hit a ramp, but they don't give you any lasting speed up. But if you just do the race and take a whole bunch of ramps, you'll find that you get a much better time than if you didn't take many ramps at all. The reason for this is that the ramps actually slow down the game timer. So you might notice if you watch that timer value on the bottom left, when I'm going over a ramp, the time is ticking quite slowly. And when I'm on flat ground, the time is ticking very, very fast. And that's just a factor of 2. So the ramps actually literally essentially make you go twice as fast just in terms of game time, but they do that by slowing down the game time. So as a result, the general strategy for playing this game well is just going to be to take pretty much all the ramps, and that's going to lower your game time as much as possible. But we can actually do better than that. So if you take a ramp, you'll find that you sort of last in the air for a particular amount of time. But if instead you just alternate the A and B buttons, what you'll find is that you kind of like float through the air a little bit. I don't know exactly why this works, but basically whenever you swap the A and B buttons, it like resets your Y speed and you can get really floaty. In fact, if we slow the game right down, I can demonstrate what this looks like in the extreme. So basically what you need to do is press down to retain your speed off a ramp, and then you just keep mashing button 1 and button 2, and the velocity keeps resetting. You get extremely floaty jumps. If you pair this with down presses as well, it helps out a lot. So what the RTA runners are going to be doing is they're going to be basically alternating that 1 and 2 button as much as they can and just floating through the air where possible. Now, of course, any extra time you spend in the air is time that you spent having the game time go half as fast. So it's going to be really optimal to do very good mashing and try and float across all your ramps and essentially just spend the entire race in the air. So with that technical explanation out of the way, let's check out what NIM1 does in this RTA world record. So this is a world record on the Japanese version of the game. You'll notice that Nim is pressing that 1 and 2 button to sort of stop the racer from falling down. It's kind of not obvious to see in full speed, but it doesn't follow a traditional jump arc. Basically, once you get to the top of the arc, the racer is going to keep just resetting that Y speed and falling slower and slower and slower. Now, it's a bit unfortunate, but Nim actually gets quite unlucky at the end of this level. Have a look at the game timer on the top left, and you'll notice that it ticks down to 20 seconds right as they cross the finish line. Given the weird way that the rounding works on the timer, that means they've lost an entire second just by losing that 1/100th of a second. The time would be 39:01 if they were just that tiny bit quicker. You can see they passed 8 cars, so they're going into the upgrade shop. But Nim can't buy the engine yet, so they're just going to go out to the next race there. Given this is game time, they can spend a lot of time just going up and selecting the upgrades they actually want to get. Now we're on to this next level, which is the equivalent of the first level on the English version. I find it really weird, but they added these houses on the left. I don't know why they added that in the Japanese version. And it's also worth mentioning that there's a bit of RNG with the cars. So the cars that you pass can be in one of 2 positions when you come across them, based on where they are on the track. And you'll notice in a little bit, one of the cars is actually going to hit one of the houses there. That is excellent news for Nim, because as soon as the car's gone off screen, the next car is sort of on a countdown to spawn. So you want to be passing as many cars as possible, and it is a game of luck, really. So Nim managed to pass another 8 cars in that race, and is going to get the engine upgrade now. Essentially what you want to do now is just chain getting the engine upgrade over and over and over. And since they have the engine upgrade for this track, they will be able to pass more cars along the track, just because you pass them a little bit faster and start loading the next one sooner. You can see Nim really expertly taking some of these ramps and doing that button mashing to sort of slow down the descent there. I can't stress enough how hard it is to just press the down button on the ramps at the right timing. So you have to press the down button when you go over the ramp, but if you keep holding it for too long, you'll lose more speed. So there's a window where you want to press it when you're on the ramp, and about 5 frames later, if you still have it pressed, you're going to lose speed. So you'll see occasionally Nim does lose the speed and drop down, but more often than not, they're getting these boosts off the ramps. And we'll see here again they passed 10 cars, so we're going to be chaining those engine upgrades together. You can just see how much time that engine saves, because it's 30 seconds versus 44 for the non-engine races. Now I won't go into every track in detail, but you can see they get 10 again here. And then they're pretty much consistently getting 10 or 9 each race. Since we have that buffer of 6 extra cars, they're not going to have any trouble getting the engine upgrade every race now. Also, I don't know why, but this Japanese exclusive track here, I absolutely just love the theming of. Something about driving at night is really good. Sort of reminds me of that Joe Satriani song, Driving at Night. Nim then makes their way to the last level, and you can see this expert rock dodging here, as well as using the jumps to get over the rocks too. Nim then clutches out the rest of the run with a pretty good time. It was a 5:37.21, and that was a world record. It's a bit weird using game time since it's got all those problems that I mentioned earlier, but it makes sense because it makes it very easy to compare. Also, the cool thing about the Japanese version is get yourself a little map like this showing you where you went. The Japanese version has a lot of extra screens like this end screen, for example. So I'll move on to talking about the English run now, and you can see that it's a pretty similar time to Japanese. That's 5:24 versus 5:37. But one thing that I really want to point out is the platforms that these games are run on. You'll notice most runs historically used NTSC, which is sort of that US version, but the top two runs here use PAL. Now the difference is NTSC is sort of the American version here, whereas PAL was released in Europe or Australia or places like that. And the difference is the PAL version runs at 50 frames a second, whereas the NTSC version runs at 60 frames a second. Now in modern games they tend to speed up the player on the PAL versions just to compensate for that time difference a bit more, but in older games like this they just did not do any compensation at all. So for most games that you speedrun, if you run the PAL version, it literally runs 20% slower, and that means that you lose a whole bunch of time, which is why people tend to speedrun games on NTSC. But given that we're measuring this in game time, well, the PAL version is actually a lot better to run for this, because if you think about it, the game's running 20% slower. That doesn't impact the game time, so every second actually takes a bit longer than a second to play out in real life, and you're essentially playing the game a little bit slowed down, which means that you've got more precision. You make less errors, you're able to mash the buttons faster, and you just get to squeeze out more game time while playing it a little bit slower and having that advantage. So it seems like these runners have only realised that PAL was better about 4 months ago, and to be honest, this is something that I never really thought of doing myself. I remember trying to pick this game up RGA and having a real hard time with it, mainly because I'm not that good at button mashing, but if I thought to play on PAL, then it might have actually given me the edge I needed to take world record. And growing up in a PAL region myself, it's always nice to see a game where PAL is optimal for running. A couple of other examples are Crash Bandicoot 2, and traditionally Banjo-Kazooie Any % was faster on PAL, but not anymore. So the main thing I want to point out with this PAL run is just how much better the floating works on PAL. Because it's going slower, you can mash that a little bit faster. So if you have a look at these ramps, Nim spends pretty much no time on the ground at all. And all the time in the air, the game time's running at half speed, so it saves a whole bunch of game time here. Apart from that, there's not a whole lot to say really. Nim gets 8 cars on the first race, so can't buy that engine upgrade until after the second race, same as the Japanese version there. And then by the end of race 6, all the points scale up to needing 20 for the engine, but Nim really has no problem having enough to buy those engine upgrades. I will stress again, the engine upgrades are really the only ones worth getting. In theory, the acceleration upgrade can save a little bit of time at the start of a race, just getting up to speed, but apart from that, nothing's really worth it. And then Nim closes out the run with an excellent time of 5:24.88. Now we're going to move on to talking about the TAS. The TAS that I've got on screen here is a game time optimized TAS that I made, and it's 3:59.10. Compared to the 5:37 RTA world record, this saves about 40 seconds over that. And how does it save 40 seconds? Well, it just spends a whole bunch of time in the air wiggling around. As I said, well, you can just mash 1 and 2 to stay in the air for a really long time, and that's exactly what this TAS does. It just stays in the air for basically the entire track. There's a little bit more nuance to it, so if you mash 1 and 2, you're going to reset your height, but occasionally you get lag frames, and you have to press the down button to get rid of those lag frames. So there's a bit to it, and if you're really good at mashing, you couldn't guarantee you'd stay in the air this long. But essentially by doing this, I can have the game time run at half speed for essentially the entire level. We do have to dip down onto ramps occasionally just to get that height boosted back up, and when you're on the ramp just for a little bit, the game time does run at normal speed again, so you do have to be careful of that. You'll see me land right before the end of the level there, and that's just to manipulate the game time that little bit lower. You'll see I get 29:01, and that's because I waited really far into that second number 31 before ending the level, as far as possible before it clicked down to 30. That means that if you're looking at game time, you're almost just on a frame rule for game time, because you only save a second if you literally save an entire second. You can't save like half a second in this TAS. Now the big issue with the game time Taz, it is slower in real time to do this. You'll notice on that first ramp I'm only at 186 speed, and I don't get up to 200 speed until that second ramp. So the optimal way to do this in real time would be to go around that first ramp and wait to build up full speed before you start jumping off ramps. For that reason I'm going to be focusing on the actual published Taz of this run, which is the real-time optimized Taz. You'll see me go around that ramp to build up to 200 speed and then jump off this ramp here. For that reason the game time is a little bit higher for this Taz, but it's only higher by about 11 seconds. Now one of the big things you can do in this Taz is manipulate the other racers. It's a bit limited as to what you can do, but essentially you can get them to crash a bit earlier and you pass 10 cars in this first race. That lets us get the engine upgrade right away. So I won't talk too much about each individual level in this Taz, but you can see the wiggling in the air is absolutely insane. You spend just most of the course in the air. But the big thing with optimizing this Taz is just making sure that you can pass 10 cars in each race. Now one really strange thing about this Taz is you're going to see me purposely hit a bunch of rocks in a second. So I'll pass this car, go off the edge and hit all these rocks. And then the other car appears and goes straight into that lamppost. So the reason for that is to manipulate the other cars. Essentially, as you're playing through this game, when you pass a car, it starts a timer of 128 frames before the next car will appear. So if you pass a car and then in theory just come to a complete stop on the track for that time and then go forward again, the next car will come up at that very next section of the track. So if you're going fast, you're going to use up more track while you're waiting for the cars. Whereas if you slow down like I did there and like I'm doing here, the next car comes sooner on the track in comparison. So basically if I don't hit this rock right at the end of the race here, what you'll see is that I'm only just barely passing the car anyway. So if I hadn't hit that rock, then I wouldn't have enough track distance to get ahead of the car. You need to do that so that you can still get 10 cars here, because if I didn't, I wouldn't have enough to buy the engine upgrade next race. And we'll see that on this race I only actually managed to pass 9 cars. That's okay because I passed 11 cars earlier, but you still need that average number to be 10, so you have 10 points for each race to buy the engine upgrade. Of course, slowing down to get those 10 cars is not super optimal, although it is definitely worth it to have that engine upgrade for each track, since the engine makes you travel a lot faster. Now towards the end of this Taz, you're going to see me purposely slow down here. The reason for that is to do with how Tazes are timed. They're actually timed to the last button press on your controller. So if I can jump off that last ramp that I need to jump off, then I can just let go of all the buttons and actually end the Taz timing before that race ends. A bit weird that it works like that, but it's pretty standard for Tazes to do that. And although I did optimize for real time primarily, you'll see that I get 0.01 on every single timer of this race, and that's just by waiting to the very end of the second to achieve that. Because I might as well have a secondary goal of game time, because there's no real downside to doing it. The other sort of difference about real time versus game time is that every ramp does give you a 1 frame boost in real time, but it loses you game time. So you'll see in a real time Taz, I'm hitting ramps a lot more often, even though I could float in the air for a little bit longer if I wanted to. And that's basically the Taz of the Japanese version done. We'll look next at the English version. So I won't talk too much about the English Taz since it's quite similar in tech to the Japanese Taz, but I decided to do it as well just to have completeness and to be able to compare it to both these RTA world records. This Taz is played on the NTSC version because power wouldn't give an advantage when you have Taz precision, and unfortunately I wasn't able to pass 10 cars on that first track. I spent days and days and days trying to map out how to pass 10 cars and manipulate them all, but it just didn't work. And with this English version, it's a lot harder to hit 10 cars on each track anyway, so if I got that engine upgrade on the first track, there's no guarantee I could keep it for the rest. But what I'm going to be doing is passing exactly as many cars as I need, because when you get to the end of track screen, every time that score counter ticks up for how many points you got, it takes an extra 8 frames, so you want to avoid that where possible. You'll see towards the end of this track I do the similar thing where I end inputs early, just by sort of not doing anything and going over all the jumps and stuff. In theory it might be fast to get the suspension upgrade since you would keep your speed going over jumps that way and end inputs much earlier, but I've never found a situation where it's actually worth it. You can also see that the amount of cars that I pass is a lot more diverse in this Taz. In the Japanese it was very consistent, but the English version you tend to just pass less cars. One other fun thing that I'll mention is that you can actually crash the game just by going too far past the finish line while floating in the air. Because the game doesn't consider you finished the race unless you're on the ground, so if you go too far here it doesn't have any more track to load and just sort of glitches out like this. Usually if it happens you just get kind of a glitchy screen like this, or you get a reset of the console. I'd love to turn it into a game end glitch somehow, but I don't see that being super likely. If you're ever playing RTA though, you want to be really careful to avoid this. On some tracks it's pretty easy to hit this. So that's going to be pretty much all for this video. I'd recommend giving this game a go if you haven't. It's pretty fun, and if you're good with mashing and good with precision, speedrun is pretty enjoyable to do as well. That's going to be it for this video, and thanks so much for watching.